you'd turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 10, please. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. So fond of technology and all that. If you need a Bible, David Manuel will hand one out to you. But I'm having some issues with my tablet today, so I can go old school if I need to, but there might be a awkward transition in the middle in case you're wondering what's going on. But 2 Corinthians chapter 10, please. And we're making our way verse by verse through the book of 2 Corinthians, and we get to chapter 10 here, and we'll notice that there's a major shifting of gears, and it's not just the subject matter that's different. There was one subject, finances, that were covered in chapters 8 and 9, but when we come to chapter 10, things are dramatically different, so much so that there are those who believe that these next 4 chapters are actually a part of a different letter that Paul had written to the Corinthians. If you remember, if you just look back at the last chapter, chapter 9, after these 2 chapters he had written on finances, he finishes chapter 9 by saying, "Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift." And it seems like right there that Paul could just kind of sign off and call it good. And there are those that believe that that's what he did. That chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13 are actually part of what he calls and refers to earlier, I think in chapter 2, he recalls the severe letter, that's what this is. But that doesn't really matter. It's all speculation, but these next chapters do have a different vibe to them. There's definitely a different tone. And it goes more of like, if you had a mom, you get this. When mom's tone, when they add the middle name kind of thing, when it's no longer Honey, but it's Tad Roger. Okay, I know there's something different going on here. And so these next few chapters are going to have their own challenges, and one of those is that he's speaking to something that's so specific in the context of his relationship to the church. And so we're really reminded, especially here and in the next couple chapters, that what we're doing is reading a letter. We're reading correspondence. We're reading what he wrote to them, which was a response to something that we don't know exactly what was going on. But, we're reminded here that we're reading someone else's mail. This past week, Charity's got all these siblings, right? And they've been texting on this group text a lot, and it's almost a full-time job for her to keep up with it. But her one sister texted out of the middle of nowhere, Reese has decided, I think I wrote it down here, what she said. I can't find it right there, but Reese has decided it's Argentina she's going to present on. Okay, that's great. But, we can kind of picture and figure out what's going on by that, the piece of it. And so 2 Corinthians is inspired correspondence that the Lord, though, he wants to speak to us. And so we don't have a specific list of the complaints and the critiques that they had for Paul, but we can kind of figure it out in their response to them. For example, before we start going through here, look at verse 12. And we just kind of see all the uses. I marked up my Bible with all different colors with this. But all the different uses of I and we and you and they, there's a lot of relationship going on here. And so he says in verse 12, "We dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves. But they, measuring themselves by themselves, comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise." Say that 10 times fast. The themselves, we're going to see, are Paul's critics. And he's got some major critics. And sometimes criticism can be really constructive. It can come from a sincere heart. And if we have kids, we've probably all said something like, "Hey, let's try putting the left shoe on the left foot and the right shoe on the right foot." There's some criticism. It's constructive. Or maybe you have a charity of your own that says, "Hey, that shirt maybe shouldn't go with those pants." We've heard these things before. They come from a sincere heart, and they can be constructive, but there's something helpful there, and it's completely different when the motives behind the criticism are not to help or construct or build up, when they're actually out to destroy and tear down and ruin someone's character and reputation. And that is what Paul is addressing here in chapter 10. Because these that are comparing themselves among themselves, that he talks about in verse 12, they're wanting to undermine his authority. They're trying to kind of commandeer the fellowship and take credit for what Paul has done. And that's going to be obvious as we read through here. Even though we don't know the backstory, we can piece it together and we can tell that's what's going on. They're trying to take credit. You know, I remember, speaking of Christmas, I think it was at a Christmas thing, I can't remember, but we were at this large family gathering. It was with my mom's whole side of the family. There's probably 40 people there. And I made a really funny joke, which I tend to do, you know, but I just kind of said it to the 3 or 4 people sitting next to me. Well, one of those people was my brother-in-law, Doug. Doug so liked my joke that he said it loud enough for everyone to hear. And all of a sudden, Doug's the funniest guy in the room with my joke. Still not quite over that. I'm sure there's something about bitterness in here somewhere. But much more than a joke, I can joke about a joke, but these people are legitimately trying to discredit Paul and take the credit. That's why they're discrediting him, so they can take the credit for themselves. And Paul's going to call them in the next chapter super apostles. He's going to say that sarcastically. And then he's going to say, actually, they're false apostles. But they're questioning everything about him. They're questioning his apostleship. Do you even have authority? Who is he to come into Corinth all the way from where he's from and tell us how to serve and worship God? And what right does he have? You know, does he even have this authority? Oh, and from chapters 8 and 9, he's pretty caught up in this Jerusalem fund. Maybe he's just a shuckster, you know, trying to get our money. He's a con man. Maybe this is like Harold Hill, you know, and he's going to sell us some instruments and then be gone out of the city, disappeared. Is he a shuckster? They don't trust him. And so all these outside voices are coming into the church from these who are trying to take credit and discredit Paul. And the church, this young church, is confused. They don't know exactly what to do. And Paul himself is in the midst of this real spiritual struggle. And so he's got a heart for them. He wants the very best for them. He wants them to grow in Christ. He wants them to be mature believers. But all of his motives, all of them are questioned. And that hurts, right? If you're a parent, you maybe have experienced that yourself. You just want the best for your kids. But your motives are always questions. And so, like a spiritual father, that's how Paul is feeling. Like, my heart is for you. That's all I want is what's best for you. And so it's breaking his heart. And I believe he doesn't want to, but reluctantly, he now has to defend his ministry from these attacks. Because all these voices from the outside, they're just inundating this young church. And so now, man, I got to stand up for myself. I don't want to, but I have to. And in doing so, he's going to give us some real identifiers of what genuine ministry should look like. I've titled this message Genuine Ministry because he tells us first, notice this, genuine ministry responds like Jesus. Look how Paul chooses to respond to this criticism in verse 1. Now I, Paul, myself, okay, got it, it's you. I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. Now, one thing that we have to just wipe out of our minds, because sometimes it's easy for us to think that meekness is actually weakness, but it's not. Meekness is actually strength, but it's strength that's under control. It's strength that can be restrained. And Jesus is meek, okay? The same Jesus who said, let the children come unto me, and the kids were clamoring to be close to him, was the same one who made a whip and then drove out the people who were exploiting the people in the temple. So Jesus understood that, and Paul says, that's how I'm going to respond to these accusations. I'm going to respond in meekness and gentleness, with strength under control. He says, I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you, with meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent am bold toward you. This last little bit of verse 1 should probably be read with a little bit of sarcasm, and Paul is known to use sarcasm. But this was one of the accusations that they had said about him, that Paul, he's this two-faced hypocrite. We get a letter from him, and he lets us have it. He's all forward and bold and correcting us, and you read 1 Corinthians, and that's what it is. So all of 1 Corinthians is correction, but as soon as he's with us, he's just this old softy. Oh man, he's not tough at all. With the persona that he sends in his letters isn't what it seems like reality is, and so he must be this hypocrite. He's two-faced, When I was really little, my great aunt and uncle had this English bulldog, and you knew it was an English bulldog by the way it would bark. It would say roof, roof, but you can repeat that joke at your family gathering. It's fine. I don't need any credit for it. But it was this dog that would just bark and bare its teeth, and it was just low to the ground. If you've seen these English bulldogs, they're just like muscular, right? And just muscles bulging and barking. And I'm a little guy, there used to be a time when I was a little guy. And I was terrified of this dog. I didn't want to get out of the car when we went to Luke and Lucy's house. But once you got up close to it, all that, it's this panting, it's this slobbering. It turned into a softie. And so this is what they're saying about Paul. Oh, you're a bulldog in your letters, but you come here and your letters got bark, but when you're here, you have no bite, Paul. You're being two-faced. And Paul says, now, I'm pleading with you in meekness and gentleness, so that I don't have to be the biting bulldog when I come. That's why I'm snarling from a distance, so that when I get there, you don't have to face me that way. He says in verse 2, but I beg you that when I'm present, I may not be bold with that confidence by which I intend to be bold against some. Hey, you think that I'm coming this way? Okay, I want to switch it up. I want you to receive what I have for you right now in meekness and gentleness. That's what I want for you, so that I don't have to be bold and harsh to you when I come. And he says, and I intend to be very bold. I intend to be very direct. I intend to be very harsh with these false teachers, but I don't want to be harsh with all of you. And so he says in verse 1, I plead. Verse 2, I beg, I want to be gentle with you. Let me be gentle with you. But those some who are telling lies about me are those who, he goes on and says, who think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. Here's accusation number 2. Along with hypocrisy, they accused him of walking in the flesh. Now, if we grew up in church or we've been parts of Bible studies, we're familiar with that term, in the flesh, having selfish motives. I want what I want. I'm looking out for number one. It's what the flesh wants. And that's generally, almost always, how Paul uses that expression. But there's kind of this other aspect to it, and that's what we have in view here. More than just saying that Paul is in this for himself or that he's walking in sin, what they're actually saying is that he's just walking in weakness. It's just flesh and blood and just his humanity. Paul's walking around. He's doing ministry. He has no real authority or power. You can almost understand this verse when you put weakness in there. And so their accusation is more, Paul's just this regular dude. He's off over there barking away, but how can he be a real apostle? How can he be truly a God-sent, genuine minister of God if he's just walking in weakness? Look, I mean, he's going to point out later on, would you look at him? I mean, he's nothing. And so Paul uses this accusation and he turns it right back around on them in verse 3. He says, for though we walk in the flesh, again, in weakness, and we're jars of clay, he said a couple chapters ago, right? Although we walk in weakness, flesh, we do not war according to the flesh, or, again, weakness. That's not how we do battle. This is so powerful. This is something that if you've never gone through here, you really need to get down this morning. Paul acknowledges that he goes through life like anybody else, in the flesh, in just flesh and bones, in a physical body. He puts his pants on one leg at a time like everybody else. He's got struggles too. But he says, what you need to know is that you got to draw the curtains back so you can see what's really going on. And number 2, mark of genuine ministry, understands that there's a spiritual war taking place right now. And Paul considers that when a Christian is going through life and you're just going through your walk and you're trying to live your life for the Lord, you are in a battle. It is warfare. There is this constant, unseen battle that is taking place. He said in Ephesians 6, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Dealing with his critics from a distance, all these people are saying stuff about him, and maybe we've been there. We've had people say some untrue things about us. That's hard, and it's difficult. And Paul says, I'm flesh and blood. That's hard for me too. But the real battle is what's behind that. It's what's taking place beyond these critics that are maybe in your face or whatever. The real battle is not what you see, it's what you can't see. And so he goes on to say, we don't war against the flesh, verse 4, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God. Yeah, we walk around in human bodies, but there's nothing that they're weak, they're broken. And Paul would say, my body is no exception to that. But there's nothing weak with how we do battle because our weapons aren't weak. We don't use carnal weapons and tactics like the world does. And again, he's talking about immaterial things here. And so he's like, we don't use the weapons and the tactics like the world, like self-promotion and manipulation and all that. That's how the world does this battling type thing and this, vying for supremacy and all of that. He says, we don't fight that way. We cannot win a spiritual battle using unspiritual weapons. And so we don't overcome the flesh by responding with more flesh. If someone is telling lies about me, okay, then I got to get in the flesh and I'm going to tell them what's up, We don't fight that battle spiritually with responding in the flesh. And so Paul, he didn't organize a march. He didn't say, hey, I'm going to march over there right now, and we're going to tell you what's up, or I'm going to go straight into Nero's office. And no, he says, our weapons are too powerful for that. They're stronger than that. Our weapons are divinely powerful. They're powerful in God, he says, for the pulling down of strongholds. And this is such a vivid picture that if he was Bob Ross, he's painting a beauty right here for us, okay? This is a really great picture for us. And you can, in your own mind, almost picture a castle. He's talking about a fortress and turrets and walls and all that. And he says, these weapons that we have that are powerful in God are for demolishing fortresses, these strongholds, the most difficult areas, right? You've seen any, medieval movie or whatever, the stronghold is the most difficult area to attack and overthrow. And he says, God's power enough to do that. And for us, what he's addressing here with the Corinthians, it's the mindset. It's these worldly philosophies and ideologies and all this stuff that is drawing us away from the truth. It's drawing us away from the heart of the gospel. Those are some strongholds. But the weapons of God can defeat that, can pull that down, can demolish it. And so he said it's this spiritual battle. Fleshly methods and attitudes and responding that way doesn't work. Our victory comes in the Lord, and we can count on God. The battle that's won with spiritual weapons. Again, Paul gives us in Ephesians chapter 6 this whole list of armament, right? And an offensive weapon as well. And he says, our defense and our weaponry, it's not carnal, it's not like the world's weaponry. Our war is fought and it's won with truth and righteousness and peace and faith, knowledge of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, and prayer. That's how the battle is won. Because there's these mindsets that take a stronghold in people's life and keep them from the gospel. And maybe it's keeping you, or it's kept you from the gospel. And forgive me if you guys have heard this before, but Charity grew up in Mormonism for years and years. And I spent months trying to convince her into the kingdom. But it wasn't until I said, Lord, I can't save her. I'm not the one to do that. Only you can do it. And I poured my heart out and prayed for her all night. And the next day she called and said, hey, I'm not a Mormon anymore. What? That's how the strongholds are defeated. It's not through human methods, carnal methods. And so maybe you're dealing with someone, or maybe that someone is you. The devil desires to get a foothold in your life because he wants to turn it into a stronghold. And that stronghold, that person in bondage, and again, if it's you, the God of this world will blind your mind, but it's through the Lord's weapons that gets pulled down, it gets defeated. And so I encourage you, man, just get on your face and cry out to the Lord. Now, the Lord's arsenal pulls down strongholds, and, verse 5, it casts down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. You can come up with your own list of what that is. Arguments and everything that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. There's plenty of it. But God's weapons are stronger than all that. Bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. Again, this is full of the imagery of warfare in Paul's day. He's talking about turrets and sieges and taking prisoners captive and all that. But again, he says it's not physical. That's not what I'm talking about. I know I can't go down there to Corinth and just knock some heads together and straighten this thing out. I'm explaining to you that there's this real unseen battle that's taking place in hearts and minds. And it's no joke. And every one of us trying to live for the Lord, this is our reality. A.W. Tozer, I believe it was, said, Christian life is not a playground, it's a battleground. We're at war, guys. And there is a lot of high things and all these things setting itself up against the knowledge of God. And all those outside voices, like the Corinthians were dealing with in a sense, are coming at us. How do we respond to that? We respond with what the Lord has. But the enemy, he's ruthless. He wants to use every single thing he can, even good things, to keep us from following the Lord. There's tripwires and landmines everywhere in this walk because he wants to mess us up. That's his goal. Some of you are familiar with C.S. Lewis and Screw Tape Letters, and it's fantastic, and I wish I could talk like John Cleese when I do this quote, but it's presented as correspondence between a senior devil named Screwtape and his nephew, this aspiring young devil named Wormwood. And so he says to Wormwood, "You will say that these are very small sins, and doubtless, like all young tempters, you are anxious to be able to report spectacular wickedness. But do remember, the only thing that matters from the enemy's point of view is to the extent to which you separate the man from the enemy or from the Lord. It does not matter how small the sins are, provided that their cumulative effect is to edge the man away from light and out into nothing. Murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. Indeed, the safest road to hell is a gradual one, a gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turns, without milestones, and without signposts." Our enemy, your enemy, he goes about as a roaring lion, Peter tells us, is out to mess you up. And he will do anything and everything to take you away from the Lord, to take you away from fellowship, to take you away from growing, and to take you away from truth and righteousness and peace. And we're constantly bombarded with this. At the campus, at our jobs, at the check stand, we're bombarded with corruption and confusion. It's all over the news. Perversion. We face this constant barrage, this attack of things and ideas and people and activities that are trying to take you and me away from what God has for us. That is why we need to fight with the right weapons. That's why, as he says here, we need to take not most thoughts captive. We need to take every thought captive. We need to bring every one of those into submission. There's not one random rebellious thought. That's the safe way. Because once you let one of them go, who knows what's going to happen? And so the thoughts of lust and fear and anger and resentment and bitterness and greed, all of those need to come. No, you need to come into captivity. You need to come under submission. And so if there's something, and this is for you to figure out, there's something in your life that began as a foothold, know this, the enemy wants to turn it into a stronghold. And so are you taking and demolishing and tearing down that stuff with the weapons that the Lord has, truth, righteousness, peace. Go to Ephesians 6 and read the armament there, the sword of the Spirit, prayer. Are you tearing that stuff down? And are you taking every thought captive? Or is the enemy just building this thing up slowly and surely, soft underfoot, without sudden turns? Verse 7, or number 3, genuine ministry places more value on the eternal than the external. It says in verse 7, do you look at things according to the outward appearance? If anyone is convinced in himself that he is Christ, let him again consider this in himself, that just as he is Christ, even so we are Christ. And so Paul is trying to correct their perspective, which we all need from time to time ourselves. He said, don't get so focused on the external. Don't think that the external is more important than the eternal. It's not about the container. It's about the contents of the container. Now, when it came to Paul, again, this is one of their attacks on him. His container wasn't all that to brag about. This is a description of Paul from around the year 200 AD, not too long after the fact. He was a man of little stature, with a bald head and crooked legs. If I'm describing you, no, I'm describing the Apostle Paul here, okay? Little stature, a bald man with crooked legs, in a good state of body, with eyebrows that meet, and a hooked nose and watery eyes. You know, this is not a great Christian mingle profile, right? Describe yourself. Well, I'm short, I'm balding, I'm bow-legged, if that helps. My eyes water. So when we watch that movie you want to watch, I'll be crying along with you. Again, put yourself in their perspective, from their point of view. Someone like that it's not impressive to us. It's not impressive to them. There's no ancient Greek statues with tiny hunched over bow-legged dudes, right? There's not one statue like that. They love the tall, stand-up, square-jawed guy that demands your attention. And so Paul, he showed up in Corinth, and they're like, you're not what I pictured in your letters. Things are a little askew here. And so Paul, again, he's trying to correct their perspective. And he says, are you really going to judge things on the outward appearance? Is that how it is now? But now Lord has done so much to you. He's dramatically changed your life. But now you're going to judge my ministry, this ministry, based on externals? Even though your life has changed? He says, look what happened to your life. Verse 8, for even if I should boast somewhat more about our authority, he's going to say, I don't want to boast, but I got to talk about this. The authority which the Lord gave us for edification and not for your destruction. I shall not be ashamed lest I seem to terrify you by letters. He turns their attention from the external to the internal and explains that my goal and my purpose is always to edify and not to terrify. I want to build you up. He said in chapter 1 that we came as helpers together for your joy. That's why we're here. That's why we do ministry. And here he says, this is what I'm boasting about. This is what is true about genuine ministry. Because genuine God-given authority, as he says here, the Lord gave us this authority, is always to build you up and to tear you down. There's some ministries and churches and pastors, I'm sorry to say, but they've made a pretty penny off of beating people up. And sometimes the sheep like it. Like, I deserve it. I deserve to get told that I'm such a terrible Christian. Oh, man, yeah, I deserve all that. And Paul says, no, it's to build you up, not to tear you down. And at Calvary, Ellensburg, we want to do that. We don't do it perfectly, obviously not. But everything we do here, from our littlest kids to our oldest adults, it's aimed at building you and your families up into maturity and growing. And Paul says the Lord, he gave us this authority to build you up, not to tear you down. But tearing down, he says, that's one of the identifiers. Because tearing down is exactly what these other guys are doing. He says, verse 10, he says, he's quoting them. He says, for his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. Again, they're focused on the external instead of the internal and the eternal. He says, let such a person, the one who says this about him, let such a person consider this, that what we are in word by letters, when we are absent, such we will also be in deed when we are present. Fair warning. Shout out to the false teachers, those who are tearing down. I want you to consider this, he says. If you want the tough Paul, if you're challenging me, that's the Paul you're going to get. Verse 12, he says, the fourth mark of genuine ministry, it doesn't concern itself with men's opinions. For, he says, verse 12, we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves. But they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. Of all the verses in this chapter I picked to say twice, why is it the tongue twister? Paul's detractors are part of a mutual admiration society. And that's a damaging, bad thing to do, right? It's not healthy for us when we compare ourselves to one another, because comparing yourself to one another is always going to do one of two things. It's either going to pull you down or it's going to puff you up. Because you're always, if that's what you're into, I'm going to compare this ministry or compare my Christian life with someone else, you can always find someone who's a little less spiritual than you are. And when you do, you're going to get puffed up with pride. Well, compared to them, I'm doing pretty great. Oh, yeah, that guy goes to church like once a month. I go twice. That's 200% more than he does. But you can also find people that seem more spiritual than you. Try to do the things that they do. I can't keep up. It's frustration waiting to happen. I can't do it. I'm never going to be like them, and it's going to drag you down. You compare yourself to one another, puff you up or pull you down. And Paul says, I don't go there. I don't play those games. I'm not into that. I just want to stay in my lane. Look at verse 13. We, however, some do that. You know, they do all that. The them and the theys and themselves. We, however, will not boast beyond measure, but within the limits of the sphere which God appointed us. A sphere which especially includes you. Now, this phrase is really interesting to me. Because I said, Paul, he just wants to stay in his lane. This phrase, the limit of the sphere, is a phrase used to describe the lane on a racetrack. And each runner has their lane to run in. And Paul's saying, I'm running in my own lane, and you're included in that. But I'm not in someone else's lane. I'm staying in my lane. Verse 14, for we're not overextending ourselves, as though our authority did not extend to you, for it was to you that we came with the gospel of Christ, not boasting of things beyond measure, that is, in other men's labors, but having hope. This is what we're hoping for, that as your faith is increased, we shall be greatly enlarged by you in our sphere. Oh, the lane is widening. To preach the gospel in regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's sphere of accomplishment. Paul says, hey, yeah, I'm running in my lane. I've got what God has called me to, the sphere of influence, and it does include you, Corinthians. I'm the one that brought the gospel there, and the Lord used me to start the church. I'm not boasting. That's just reality. And he says, I don't want to boast about what someone else did, but that's what they're doing. Do you see that? They're trying to jump into my lane here. Now, I've been faithful in the sphere that the Lord has given me, and my hope is, he says, I hope you caught that as your faith is increased, as you're maturing and growing with Christ, that it would actually result, because you're a part of what I've done, that as you're growing, that my lane would be widening. So I can take the gospel to more places as you're growing and maturing and spreading and multiplying. And Paul would say, actually, I want to go to Spain. I want to bring the gospel to Spain. And so he says, man, I just want my lane to widen, but I'm not trying to take someone else's. I'm not trying to jump lanes. I'm not saying both these lanes are mine. Now, in Paul's day, again, and in our own, there's so many pastors and ministries and organizations and parachurch organizations that want to compete for the spotlight. We got to grow bigger. We got to look better. We got to act cooler. We got to do all that. Well, it takes a lot of energy to pretend to be something you're not. And the Lord is just looking for us to be faithful right where he has us, right in the lane that he's planted us in. And so not only in a ministry, this chapter is about ministry, but not only in ministry, but each one of us has a lane. We all have our sphere of influence, this lane to run in that the Lord has appointed us. And all I have to worry about is staying in our lane. Just be faithful with the calling God has for you. If he's got you as a small group leader or just a dad or a mom, whatever that is, you just stay in the lane. If that's what God's called you to, you just stay in that lane. You don't need to start running someone else's race for them. You don't have to speculate, if I was on that track, this is how I would run that race. You just be faithful for the Lord has you, because that is how he measures success in a ministry and in your personal walk with him, is are you faithful to where he has you? And so the question that we got to ask ourselves, I want us to ask ourselves as we leave here, is how are we doing in our sphere of influence? How faithful are we with where the Lord has us, in our jobs, with our families, at work, with our friends? Because that's how the Lord measures success. And if we're faithful with that, he might widen your lane too. Now, genuine ministry. Number one, responds like Jesus. Number two, understands that there's a spiritual war taking place. Number three, it places more value on the external than on the internal. I got to quit reading and just say it. On the eternal than the external, and doesn't concern itself with men's opinions. Number four, genuine ministry glorifies God. Verse 17. He who glories, let him glory in the Lord. There's a lot in that little quote from Jeremiah 9. A lot of other things to glory in. He says, let's fine-tune that. Let's just pick one thing to glory in. Let him who glories, glory in the Lord. If you want something to glory, to brag about who God is. Because as long as we're giving him the glory, as long as he will continue to use our lives. We're going to stay useful. When we're giving him glory and reflecting everything back to him, that's when we're useful. But the moment that we start thinking, yeah, I brought that person to the Lord, I'm really responsible for the success of that ministry. The moment we start doing that and taking the glory is the moment that we stop being useful. We start spinning our wheels. It's God's glory that matters. It's him increasing and us decreasing. 4 verse 18, not he who commends himself is approved, not the one who pats himself on the back, but whom the Lord commends. It is what the Lord says about your life that really endures and matters. It doesn't matter how many letters you have after your name, how many ribbons and trophies and degrees and accomplishments and commendations and all that. The only thing at the end of our life that's going to matter is to hear the Lord say, well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your Lord. It's good advice for ministry, right? Respond like Jesus. Understand that there's a spiritual battle, a war taking place. Put more value on the eternal than the external. Don't concern yourself with men's opinions. And glorify God. That's good advice for ministry. Here is my final exhortation to you, is to remember that we're all in the ministry. It's not just me and Isaac. We're all in the ministry. Ephesians 4 says, actually my job is just to equip you for the ministry. You're all the ministers. This is your instruction. You need to, when people are criticizing you, you need to respond like Jesus in gentleness and meekness. You need to understand that when someone's barking at you and telling lies about you and stabbing you in the back, that, oh man, there's a spiritual war taking place. I can't respond in kind. There's something greater happening that is unseen that needs to be dealt with. We need to, ourselves, all of us, place the emphasis on the eternal and not the external. don't get caught up. We all need to not get so caught up in what other people are thinking, what their opinions are. We just got to stay in our lane and do what the Lord has called us to do. If it's a dad, be the best darn dad you can be. If it's a mom, be a faithful mom. If it's leading youth or the college group or working in the part of the women's ministry or the men's ministry, just stay in your lane and be faithful, and you'll be successful and usable. And number 5, it's going to bring glory to God. Amen? Let's pray.